The bitter wind tore through her threadbare coat as Marissa Vance pressed herself deeper into the hay, her fingers numb despite being tucked against her ribs, and she wondered if this would finally be the night the cold claimed her for good. She had been traveling for 3 weeks now, ever since the stagecoach she had been riding on was robbed just outside of Bismarck. The bandits had taken everything, leaving the passengers stranded on the prairie with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Most had made it to the nearest settlement within a day or two, but Marissa had been heading to Fargo, North Dakota, to meet her cousin who had promised her work in the dress shop she owned. With no money for another ticket and winter approaching fast in the fall of 1883, she had no choice but to walk. The journey that should have taken a few hours by coach had stretched into an endless nightmare of cold nights and hungry days. At first, she had tried to find shelter in abandoned buildings or under bridges, but as the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, she discovered that haystacks provided the best protection. Farmers stacked them high for their cattle, and if she burrowed deep enough into the center, the hay held just enough warmth from the day to keep her from freezing entirely. It was not comfortable, and the straw poked through her clothes and scratched her skin raw, but it kept her alive. Tonight was the coldest yet. She had made it to the outskirts of Fargo just as the sun was setting, her feet blistered and bleeding inside her worn boots. The town stretched before her like a promise, lights flickering in windows, smoke rising from chimneys. She could smell bread baking somewhere, and her stomach cramped with hunger. But she had no money, no way to pay for a room or a meal, and the dress shop would not open until morning. So she had stumbled past the edge of town to a small ranch she spotted, found a large haystack near the barn, and dug herself into it like a desperate animal. The wind howled outside her makeshift shelter, and she pulled her knees tighter to her chest. Her whole body shook with cold despite the hay packed around her. She tried to think of warm things, of summer days back in Ohio before her parents died, of hot coffee and wool blankets, but the cold crept deeper into her bones with each passing minute. She must have dozed off despite the cold, because she woke to the sound of footsteps crunching through the frost-covered grass. Her heart leaped into her throat. She held perfectly still, barely breathing as the footsteps came closer. "I know someone is in there," a man's voice called out, deep and rough but not unkind. "I can see where the hay has been disturbed. Come on out. I am not going to hurt you." Marissa squeezed her eyes shut, debating whether to stay hidden or reveal herself. If she stayed quiet, he might go away. But if he was the owner of this property, he might also call the law and she could be arrested for trespassing. "Listen," the voice continued, closer now. "It is going to drop below freezing tonight. You will not survive in there. Come inside where it is warm." Something in his tone made her believe him. Slowly, painfully, she began to extract herself from the hay. Her limbs were so stiff from cold and exhaustion that she could barely move. She pushed aside the outer layer of straw and emerged into the moonlight, hay clinging to her hair and clothes, her face pale and drawn. The man who stood before her was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a thick beard that obscured most of his face. He wore a heavy coat and leather gloves, and his breath came out in white puffs in the frigid air. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, dark and warm and filled with concern as he took in her bedraggled appearance. "Good Lord," he said softly. "How long have you been out here?" "Just tonight," she managed through chattering teeth. "I am sorry for trespassing. I will leave. You will do no such thing." He stepped forward and, without asking permission, shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The warmth of it, still heated from his body, made her gasp. "Come on, let us get you inside." "I cannot pay you," she said quickly, even as her body screamed at her to accept his help. I do not have any money. Did I ask for money? He raised an eyebrow. Come on now, before we both freeze out here. He turned and started walking toward the small house that sat about 50 yards from the barn. Marissa hesitated for only a moment before following him. She could not feel her feet anymore, and each step sent shooting pains up her legs. He must have noticed her struggling because he stopped and turned back. Before she could protest, he had swept her up into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. She was too cold and tired to be embarrassed. She just let her head rest against his shoulder as he carried her toward the house. My name is Xavier Crawford, he said as he mounted the steps to the porch. I own this ranch, just me and a couple of hired hands, though they have gone into town for the evening. Marissa Vance, she whispered. He pushed open the door with his boot and carried her inside. The warmth hit her like a physical force, and she started shaking even harder as her body tried to adjust to the change in temperature. Xavier set her down carefully in a chair near the stove and immediately began stoking the fire, adding more wood until it roared. When did you last eat? He asked, not looking at her as he worked. 2 days ago, she admitted. A farmer's wife gave me some bread and cheese. He swore under his breath and moved to the kitchen area. The house was small but well kept, with sturdy furniture and clean floors. Everything had its place, organized with military precision. Marissa watched as Xavier pulled out a pot and began ladling what looked like beef stew into a bowl. The smell of it made her dizzy with hunger. He set the bowl on the table along with a spoon and a thick slice of bread. Eat slowly, he cautioned. Your stomach will not be used to it. She wanted to devour the food, but she forced herself to take small bites, letting each spoonful warm her from the inside. Xavier busied himself making coffee, and soon the rich aroma filled the small house. He poured 2 cups and sat down across from her, watching her eat with those serious dark eyes. What brings you to Fargo in the middle of winter with no money and no coat? He asked. Between bites, Marissa told him about the stagecoach robbery, about her cousin in town and the promised job at the dress shop. She told him about walking for 3 weeks, about sleeping in haystacks and under bridges, about going hungry more often than not. Xavier listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. You could have died, he said finally. Another night or 2 like this, and I would have found a frozen body in my haystack come morning. I know, she said softly, but I did not know what else to do. I had to get to Fargo. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. You will stay here tonight, he said, his tone brooking no argument. I will take you to your cousin's place in the morning. I cannot take your bed, Marissa protested. You have already done too much. You are not taking my bed. He turned to face her. You are staying in it. I will sleep in the barn. Absolutely not. She stood up, though her legs wobbled beneath her. This is your house. I will not turn you out of it, and I will not have a woman sleep in my barn while I take the house. His jaw was set in a stubborn line. It would not be proper. Then I will go to the barn, she insisted. You will freeze to death. Then so will you. They stared at each other across the small room, neither willing to back down. Finally, Xavier sighed and ran a hand through his hair. Fine, he said. We will compromise. You take the bed. I will sleep in the chair by the stove. That way we are both inside where it is warm and propriety is maintained. Marissa wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a heavy weight. The food in her stomach and the warmth from the stove were making it hard to keep her eyes open. All right, she agreed quietly, but only for tonight. Xavier showed her to the small bedroom off the main room. It was as neat and organized as the rest of the house, with a large bed covered in thick quilts and a washstand in the corner. He brought her a clean nightshirt and told her there was water in the pitcher if she wanted to wash. "Thank you," Marissa said, emotion thickening her voice. "You saved my life tonight." "Anyone would have done the same," Xavier said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. But Marissa knew that was not true. Plenty of people had passed her on the road these past weeks without stopping. Plenty had turned her away from their doors. Xavier Crawford had not only helped her, but he had given up his own comfort to do so. After he closed the door, Marissa stripped off her filthy, hay-covered clothes and washed as best she could with the cold water from the pitcher. The nightshirt was far too big, hanging almost to her ankles, but it was clean and soft. She climbed into the bed and pulled the quilts up to her chin. The mattress was firm but comfortable, and the pillows smelled faintly of soap and something else, something woodsy and masculine that she realized must be Xavier's scent. She meant to stay awake and think about everything that had happened, but sleep claimed her almost immediately, dragging her down into dark, dreamless depths. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the window and the smell of bacon filled the air. For a moment, she could not remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back and she sat up quickly, her heart racing. How late had she slept? Her cousin would be expecting her at the dress shop. She found her clothes washed and dried, folded neatly on a chair by the door. Someone, Xavier, she assumed, had cleaned them while she slept. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons, and emerged into the main room. Xavier stood at the stove, cooking breakfast. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes, and Marissa felt a pang of guilt. He had probably not slept well in the chair. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her. "How do you feel?" "Much better," she said honestly. "Thank you again for everything. Sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." They ate together in comfortable silence, bacon and eggs and more of the thick bread slathered with butter. Marissa tried not to eat too quickly, but everything tasted so good after weeks of near starvation. After breakfast, Xavier hitched up his wagon and they drove into Fargo. The town was bustling with morning activity, people hurrying along the wooden sidewalks, wagons and horses filling the main street. Xavier pulled up in front of a neat little shop with a sign that read, "Mrs. Alina Hart, dressmaker and milliner." "This is the place?" he asked. Marissa nodded, suddenly nervous. She had not seen her cousin Alina in years, not since before Marissa's parents died. What if Alina had changed her mind about the job? What if she did not want Marissa here after all? Xavier seemed to sense her hesitation. "Would you like me to come in with you?" "No," Marissa said, straightening her shoulders. "I can do this. You have already done more than enough." She climbed down from the wagon, but before she could walk away, Xavier caught her hand. "If things do not work out," he said quietly, "you know where my ranch is. You would be welcome there." The sincerity in his eyes made her throat tight. "Thank you, Xavier, for everything." She turned and walked into the shop before she could lose her courage. A bell jangled above the door, and a woman looked up from behind the counter. She was in her late 30s, with dark hair streaked with gray and a kind face that broke into a wide smile when she saw Marissa. "Marissa. Oh, my dear girl, I have been so worried." Alina rushed around the counter and pulled Marissa into a tight hug. "I heard about the stagecoach robbery. When you did not arrive, I feared the worst." Relief flooded through Marissa so strongly that her knees went weak. "I had to walk. It took longer than I expected. You poor thing." "Come, sit down. Tell me everything." Marissa spent the next hour telling her cousin about her journey, though she left out the worst parts, not wanting to worry Alina more than necessary. She did tell her about Xavier and how he had found her in the haystack and given her shelter. "Xavier Crawford," Alina mused. "I know of him. He has a ranch just outside town, keeps to himself mostly, but folks say he is a good man. Came here from Texas about 5 years ago, bought up some land, and has been building his herd ever since. She studied Marissa with sharp eyes. He sounds like a true gentleman. He was very kind, Marissa said, feeling her cheeks heat. Eleanor smiled knowingly but did not push. Instead, she showed Marissa the small apartment above the shop where she would be living and explained the work she would be doing. The job was everything Eleanor had promised in her letters: good pay, comfortable lodging, and the chance to learn a respectable trade. Marissa threw herself into the work with determination. She had always been good with a needle, and Eleanor was an excellent teacher. Within a few days, Marissa was helping with simple alterations. Within a week, she was sewing basic garments. The work was satisfying, and Eleanor was wonderful company, full of stories and laughter. But despite her comfort and security, Marissa found her thoughts drifting to Xavier Crawford. She wondered how he was doing, if he was sleeping in his own bed again, if he ever thought about the night he found a half-frozen woman in his haystack. She told herself it was just gratitude, that she simply wanted to thank him properly for saving her life. But she knew it was more than that. 2 weeks after arriving in Fargo, Marissa made a decision. She asked Eleanor if she could have Saturday afternoon off, and her cousin agreed readily. Marissa used some of her first wages to buy the ingredients for a pie apple, which seemed fitting for autumn. She spent Friday evening baking it, and Saturday morning she borrowed Eleanor's mare and rode out to Xavier's ranch. Her heart pounded as she rode up the drive. What if he was not home? What if he thought she was being forward? But she had to do this. She had to see him again. Xavier was in the paddock working with a young horse when she arrived. He looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, and his expression of surprise slowly transformed into something that looked almost like pleasure. "Marissa," he said, walking over to the fence, "I was not expecting you." "I hope I am not intruding," she said, suddenly shy. "I wanted to bring you this." She held up the pie, "to thank you properly." Xavier's face softened. "You did not have to do that." "I wanted to," she said firmly. He opened the gate and took the horse's reins, leading the mare to the water trough. "Come inside. We can have some of that pie with coffee." They sat at the same table where Marissa had eaten her first real meal in weeks, and Xavier cut generous slices of the pie. It was good, the apples sweet and the crust flaky, and Marissa felt proud watching him enjoy it. "How are things at the dress shop?" he asked. "Wonderful," she said. "Eleanor is teaching me so much. I have my own little apartment above the shop, and I am saving money for the first time in my life." She smiled. "All thanks to you. You would have made it to town eventually," Xavier said, though his eyes were warm. "Maybe," Marissa allowed, "but I might have frozen to death first." They talked easily, conversation flowing naturally from one topic to another. Xavier told her about his ranch, about the challenges of building a herd and managing the land. He spoke about Texas and why he had left, a bad drought that killed his family's cattle and forced them to sell the ranch that had been in the Crawford family for generations. He had come north looking for better opportunities and found them here in North Dakota. Marissa told him about Ohio, about growing up with her parents who had run a small general store. She told him about their deaths, her father first from a heart attack, her mother following 6 months later from grief and pneumonia. She told him about the months of struggling to keep the store running alone, about the debt collectors who eventually forced her to sell everything, about Eleanor's letter arriving at exactly the right time with an offer of a new start. "You have been through a lot," Xavier said quietly. "So have you," Marissa replied. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them, some understanding that needed no words. They were both survivors, both people who had lost everything and were trying to build new lives from the ashes of the old. Marissa started visiting the ranch every Saturday. She told herself she was just being friendly, just maintaining a connection with someone who had helped her. But she looked forward to those afternoons all week, counting down the days until she could see Xavier again. They would talk for hours, and sometimes he would show her around the ranch, introducing her to his horses and the small herd of cattle he was building. He had 2 hired hands who lived in the bunkhouse, a grizzled older man named Pete and a young cowboy named Jim. Both treated her with respect, tipping their hats and calling her Miss Vance. As autumn deepened into winter, the visits grew longer. Sometimes Marissa would bring ingredients and cook dinner for Xavier and his hands. She enjoyed it, enjoyed filling the ranch house with the smells of good food and the sound of conversation. The hired hands would eat and then discreetly disappear, leaving Xavier and Marissa alone by the fire. It was during one of these evenings in early December that things changed between them. Snow was falling outside, thick and heavy, and Xavier had insisted that Marissa stay until the storm passed. They sat by the fire, drinking coffee and talking about nothing in particular when Xavier suddenly went quiet. "What is it?" Marissa asked. "I have been wanting to say something," he said slowly, not looking at her, "but I was not sure if I should." Marissa's heart began to race. "You can tell me anything." Xavier took a deep breath and finally met her eyes. "I look forward to your visits more than anything else in my week. When you are here, this house feels like a home instead of just a place to sleep. And I know that you come here out of gratitude, because I helped you that night, but I need you to know that my feelings for you have become something more than friendship." Marissa felt as if all the air had left her lungs. "Xavier, you do not have to say anything," he said quickly. "I just needed you to know, and if you would rather not come here anymore, I will understand." "No," Marissa said, finding her voice. "I do not want to stop coming here. And I do not visit out of gratitude." She paused, gathering her courage. "I visit because I care about you, because I think about you all week, because being here with you is the happiest I have felt since before my parents died." The hope that bloomed in Xavier's eyes took her breath away. "Marissa, are you saying?" "I am saying that I have feelings for you too," she said softly. Xavier stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair. He took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "May I court you properly?" he asked. "I know I am just a rancher without much to offer, but I would like the chance to show you how much you mean to me." "You are not just anything," Marissa said fiercely. "You are kind and honorable, and you work harder than anyone I have ever met. And yes, I would very much like you to court me." Xavier smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious face, and Marissa realized she had never seen him look truly happy before. It made him even more handsome, and her heart swelled with affection for this man who had saved her life and was now offering her his heart. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Marissa did not want to pull away. She wanted him. Their lips met in a soft, tentative kiss that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "So have I," Marissa whispered. The storm raged outside, but inside the ranch house, everything was warm and perfect. They sat together by the fire, Marissa tucked against Xavier's side, his arm around her shoulders, and talked about their hopes for the future. Xavier spoke of expanding his ranch, of building it into something that would last for generations. Marissa talked about becoming a skilled dressmaker, maybe even opening her own shop someday. And slowly, carefully, they began to weave their separate dreams into something shared. The courtship that followed was everything Marissa had never dared to dream of. Xavier came into town every Sunday after church, all dressed up in his best clothes, to to take her for walks or to the social events that happened at the community hall. He was attentive and respectful, always conscious of her reputation, always treating her like she was something precious. In January, when the snow lay deep and white across the prairie, Xavier took her on a sleigh ride under the stars. They were bundled in furs and blankets, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air, the only sound the whisper of the runners on the snow and the distant howl of wolves. Xavier pulled the sleigh to a stop on a small rise overlooking his ranch, the house and barn and outbuildings looking like a toy village in the moonlight. "This is what I see when I think about my future," he said, his arm around her. "This land, this ranch. But lately, when I picture it, you are there too, in the house, in the barn, everywhere. I cannot imagine my life here without you in it anymore." Marissa turned to look at him, her breath catching at the intensity in his eyes. "Xavier." "I love you, Marissa," he said simply. "I think I started falling in love with you the night I found you in my haystack, so small and cold and determined to survive. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make everything better just by being there. I love the sound of your laugh and the way you bite your lip when you are concentrating on your sewing. I love everything about you." Tears pricked at Marissa's eyes, but they were happy tears. "I love you too," she said. "I love how gentle you are with the horses, how hard you work, how you always try to do the right thing. I love your quiet strength and your kindness. I love you, Xavier Crawford." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, pouring all his feelings into it. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Xavier reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. "I know we have only been courting for a few months," he said, "and I know that some people would say we should wait longer. But I am 30 years old, Marissa, and I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. Life is short and uncertain, and I do not want to waste any more time." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," Marissa said without hesitation. "Yes, yes, yes." Xavier's whoop of joy startled the horse, and they both laughed as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. They were married in March, when the snow was starting to melt and the first hints of spring appeared on the prairie. The ceremony took place in the small church in Fargo, with Alina standing up as Marissa's witness and Pete serving as Xavier's. The whole town turned out, curious about the rancher who kept to himself and the young seamstress who had won his heart. Marissa wore a dress she had made herself, simple but elegant, with tiny pearl buttons down the back and lace at the collar and cuffs. Alina wove flowers into her hair, early crocuses that Xavier had found and brought to her that morning. He stood at the altar in a new suit, his hair trimmed and his beard neat, and when Marissa walked down the aisle toward him, the look on his face made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Marissa barely heard the words. She was too focused on Xavier, on the way he held her hands, on the love shining in his eyes. When it came time for the vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I, Xavier, take you, Marissa, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, to honor you, to care for you in sickness and in health, in good times and in bad, for as long as we both shall live." Marissa's voice shook with emotion as she repeated her own vows, but she meant every word with her whole heart. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and told Xavier he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was soft and sweet and full of promise for all the years to come. The reception was held at the community hall, with music and dancing and more food than Marissa had seen in one place since before her parents died. Everyone wanted to congratulate them, to wish them well, to toast their happiness. Xavier kept Marissa close to his side all evening, his hand at the small of her back or holding hers, as if he could not bear to let her go even for a moment. When the party finally wound down, Xavier loaded their gifts and Marissa's belongings into the wagon and drove them home to the ranch. Home. The word sang through Marissa's heart. She had not had a real home since her parents died, had not belonged anywhere or to anyone. Now she had both. Xavier carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing, and set her down gently in the middle of the main room. The house looked different than it had the first time Marissa saw it. She and Alina had spent the past few weeks making curtains and cushions, adding little touches of comfort and beauty. Fresh flowers sat on the table, and the bed in the room that would now be theirs was made up with new quilts that Alina had given them as a wedding gift. "Welcome home, Mrs. Crawford," Xavier said softly, his arms around her waist. "It feels like a dream," Marissa whispered. "Like I am going to wake up and find myself back in that haystack, freezing and alone." "You are never going to be alone again," Xavier promised. "I am here and I am never leaving you." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Marissa felt the last of her fears melt away. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Their first year of marriage was not without its challenges. Ranching was hard work, and money was tight as Xavier tried to expand his herd. There were late calves and sick horses, fences that needed mending and hay that needed cutting. Marissa helped where she could, learning to handle the horses and tend the garden, all while continuing to take in sewing work from Alina to bring in extra money. But despite the challenges, Marissa had never been happier. She loved the rhythm of ranch life, the way each day brought new tasks and new satisfactions. She loved waking up next to Xavier every morning, his arm heavy across her waist, his breath warm against her neck. She loved cooking meals for him and his hired hands, loved the way he would come in tired and dirty from a day's work and light up when he saw her. She loved the quiet evenings by the fire, Xavier reading the newspaper while she sewed, comfortable in their shared silence. In November, almost exactly a year after Xavier had found her in his haystack, Marissa realized she was pregnant. She waited until she was sure before telling him, wanting to be absolutely certain. When she finally shared the news one evening after dinner, Xavier's reaction was everything she had hoped for. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests, his face split with the widest grin she had ever seen. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "We are going to be parents." "You are going to be such a good father," Marissa said, cupping his face in her hands. "Our children are going to be so lucky to have you." The pregnancy was not easy. Marissa was sick most mornings, and as the baby grew, simple tasks became difficult. But Xavier was endlessly patient and supportive, taking over the heavier chores without complaint and making sure she rested as much as possible. Alina came out to the ranch often, bringing supplies and offering advice, having raised 3 children of her own. In June of 1885, on a hot summer afternoon, Marissa went into labor. Alina and the doctor from town were both there, and Xavier paced outside the bedroom door, wearing a path in the floorboards with his worried strides. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Xavier could hear Marissa's cries through the door, and each one felt like a knife to his heart. He wanted to go to her, to hold her hand and offer comfort, but Alina insisted it was better if he stayed out. Finally, in the early afternoon of the second day, the sound of a baby crying filled the house. Xavier froze, his heart pounding, until Alina opened the door with a tired but happy smile. "You have a son," she said. "A big, healthy boy, and Marissa is fine, just exhausted." Xavier pushed past her into the room. Marissa lay in the bed, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale, but she was smiling as she held a small bundle wrapped in blankets. Xavier crossed to her side and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a surprising amount of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. He was the most beautiful thing Xavier had ever seen, except for the woman who had brought him into the world. "You want to hold him?" Marissa asked softly. Xavier nodded, not trusting his voice, and carefully took the baby from her. The weight of his son in his arms, so small and fragile and perfect, brought tears to his eyes. "We made this," he said in wonder. "We made a whole person." "We did," Marissa agreed, her own eyes wet with happy tears. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son's face, Xavier knew exactly what felt right. "William," he said. "After your father, William Thomas Crawford." Marissa's face crumpled and she started to cry in earnest. "Oh, Xavier, that is perfect. Papa would have been so proud." Xavier sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to jostle Marissa, and they bent their heads together over their son, marveling at the miracle they had created. Little William was a good baby, sleeping well and eating with enthusiasm. Xavier was completely besotted, often getting up in the night to help with feedings, just sitting and holding his son while Marissa dozed. He would stare at William's tiny face for hours, tracing the shape of his nose or counting his impossibly small fingers and toes. As William grew from an infant into a toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Xavier's careful management and hard work paid off, and the herd grew larger each year. They were able to hire 2 more hands and build a bigger barn. Marissa's sewing business also flourished, and she was soon making more intricate dresses and even some suits for the men in town. When William was 3 years old, Marissa discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1888, she gave birth to a daughter they named Grace Elena Crawford, after the Grace that had brought them together and the cousin who had given Marissa a new start in Fargo. Grace was smaller than William had been, with blonde hair like Marissa's and Xavier's dark eyes. She was a fussy baby, keeping them up at night with her cries, but Xavier was just as patient with her as he had been with William. Marissa would often wake in the night to find Xavier walking the floor with Grace against his shoulder, singing old cowboy songs in his deep, rumbling voice until she settled. Life fell into a comfortable pattern. The children grew, the ranch prospered, and Xavier and Marissa's love for each other only deepened with time. They had their disagreements, of course, as all couples do. Xavier could be stubborn about his way of doing things, and Marissa had a temper when pushed too far. But they had learned to talk through their problems, to never go to bed angry, to remember that they were partners in all things. William grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the horses and followed his father around the ranch like a shadow. Grace was more outgoing, constantly chattering and asking questions about everything she saw. Xavier doted on both of them, teaching William to ride and letting Grace help him with the simpler chores around the ranch. In 1891, Marissa had their 3rd child, another boy they named James after Xavier's father. James was the easiest of their babies, happy and content, with a smile for everyone. With 3 children under the age of 6, the house was always full of noise and laughter, and the controlled chaos of family life. Elena came out to the ranch often, delighted to be an honorary grandmother to the children. She would bring treats and new clothes she had sewn, and sit for hours telling them stories or playing games. Pete and Jim and the other hired hands also became part of the extended family, teaching the children about ranching and sneaking them sweets when they thought Marissa was not looking. The years passed in a blur of work and joy, and the small, everyday moments that make up a life. The children grew, the ranch expanded, and Xavier and Marissa grew older together, their love a constant through all the changes. In 1895, when William was 10, Grace was 7, and James was 4, Xavier surprised Marissa by announcing that he had bought the adjacent property, nearly doubling the size of the ranch. "It is for them," he said, gesturing to where the children were playing in the yard. "So they will have something to inherit, something that will last. The Crawford Ranch will be here long after we are gone." Marissa leaned against his side, watching their children. "Do you ever think about that night I spent in your haystack?" she asked. "About how different things could have been if you had not found me." "I think about it all the time," Xavier admitted. "I think about how close I came to never meeting you, to never having this life. It terrifies me." "But you did find me," Marissa said. "You saved me in more ways than one. You gave me not just shelter but a home, not just safety but love, not just a future but a family." She turned to face him. "I love you, Xavier Crawford, more now than even on the day we married." "I love you too," Xavier said, pulling her close. "More than I have words to say." He kissed her there in the yard, with their children playing nearby and the prairie stretching out in all directions around them. It was a simple moment, ordinary really, but it was everything. As the children grew older, they each developed their own interests and personalities. William, serious and hardworking, was clearly going to take over the ranch someday. He had Xavier's way with horses and a natural head for the business side of ranching. Grace was the wild one, always climbing trees or riding too fast or getting into some kind of mischief. She had Marissa's determination and Xavier's stubbornness, a combination that led to many spirited discussions around the dinner table. James was the peacemaker, gentle and kind, with a gift for music. Xavier had bought a piano from a family moving out of the territory, and James would sit at it for hours, picking out melodies. In 1898, when Marissa was 33 and Xavier was 41, they had their fourth and final child, a daughter they named Sarah Rose. She was a surprise, coming 10 years after they thought they were done having children, but she was welcomed with joy by the entire family. William, now 13, was fiercely protective of his baby sister. Grace, at 10, loved playing mother and would carry Sarah around like a doll. And James, at 7, would play his piano for her whenever she cried. Xavier and Marissa adjusted to being parents to a newborn again, though it was harder now that they were older. But watching their older children with their baby sister, seeing the love and gentleness they showed her, made every sleepless night worth it. The turn of the century found the Crawford family firmly established as one of the most successful ranching operations in the area. Xavier had a reputation for fairness and honesty, and he employed nearly a dozen men year-round. Marissa still did some sewing, but mostly for pleasure now rather than necessity. She also started a small school on the ranch, teaching not just her own children but the children of the ranch hands and nearby farms. In 1903, Alina passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 58. Marissa grieved deeply for the cousin who had given her a second chance when she needed it most. At the funeral, Marissa spoke about how Alina had been more than family. She had been a friend and a mother figure, and the reason Marissa had come to Fargo in the first place. "If not for cousin Alina, I never would have been on that stagecoach," Marissa said, tears streaming down her face. "I never would have been robbed and stranded. I never would have ended up sleeping in Xavier's haystack. And I never would have found the love and the life that have made me happier than I ever dreamed possible. So while I mourn her loss, I also celebrate the gift she gave me by bringing me here." Xavier stood beside her, his arm around her waist, offering silent support. That night, back at the ranch, he held her while she cried for the woman who had been such an important part of their story. The years continued to roll by, bringing both joys and sorrows. William, at 18, fell in love with a rancher's daughter from the next county, a smart, capable girl named Rebecca. They married in 1903, and Xavier deeded them a portion of the ranch to build their own house and start their own life. Watching his son take a bride reminded Xavier of his own wedding day, of how young and hopeful he and Marissa had been. Grace, true to her independent nature, announced at 16 that she wanted to go to Teachers College in Bismarck. Xavier and Marissa were hesitant at first, worried about their daughter being so far from home, but they ultimately supported her dream. Grace excelled in her studies and returned 2 years later to teach at the school in Fargo. James, at 14, was still content to stay on the ranch, though his heart was clearly in his music. Xavier built him a small studio in one of the outbuildings where he could practice without disturbing the rest of the family. Local folks started hiring James to play at weddings and dances, and he earned a reputation as the best piano player in the territory. Sarah, the baby, was 8 years old and showed signs of inheriting both her mother's skill with a needle and her father's way with animals. She could often be found either sewing doll clothes or out in the barn talking to the horses. In 1908, William and Rebecca had their first child, making Xavier and Marissa grandparents for the first time. The baby boy, named Xavier after his grandfather, was perfect in every way. Xavier the elder was utterly undone by his tiny namesake, spending hours just holding him and making faces to get him to smile. "I did not think it was possible to love someone as much as I love our children," Xavier told Marissa one evening as they watched William and Rebecca with their son. "But now there is this little one, and my heart feels like it is going to burst." "Being a grandparent is different," Marissa agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. They were both graying now, lines etched on their faces from years of sun and hard work and laughter. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who had fallen in love in a small ranch house on a cold winter night. "We get all the joy without quite as much of the exhaustion." More grandchildren followed. William and Rebecca had 3 more children over the next few years. Grace married a teacher from Bismarck in 1910 and had twin girls. James, surprising everyone, fell in love with a widow who had 2 children of her own, and they married in 1912. Even young Sarah, growing into a beautiful young woman, was being courted by the son of a neighboring rancher. Through it all, Xavier and Marissa remained the center of their growing family. The ranch house had been expanded several times over the years, with extra bedrooms and a larger dining room to accommodate everyone for the Sunday dinners that had become a Crawford family tradition. The table would be crowded with children and grandchildren, with laughter and conversation and the passing of dishes, and Xavier would look down the length of it to where Marissa sat at the other end, and his heart would swell with gratitude for the life they had built together. In 1915, on a cold November evening much like the night they had met, Xavier and Marissa sat by the fire in their bedroom. They were both in their early 50s now, their hair more gray than dark, their bodies marked by the years of hard work. But they still held hands like young sweethearts, still stole kisses when they thought no one was looking, still loved each other with a depth and constancy that had only grown over the years. "You remember the night we met?" Marissa asked, staring into the flames. 32 years ago this month." "I remember everything about that night," Xavier said. "I remember hearing noises near the barn and going to investigate. I remember calling out and seeing you emerge from that haystack, looking like you might blow away in the wind." I remember how your teeth were chattering and how your eyes were full of pride even though you were clearly desperate. I remember thinking you were the biggest man I had ever seen, Marissa said with a smile. And then you took off your coat and wrapped it around me, and I thought you might be the kindest man I had ever met. I was right about that part. I knew that night, Xavier admitted. Before I even knew your name, I knew that you were going to change my life. I just did not realize how much or how thoroughly for the better. We have had a good life, have we not? Marissa said softly. The best life, Xavier confirmed. Better than I ever dared to hope for. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire and listening to the wind outside. Finally, Marissa spoke again. I want you to know that if I had my life to live over, I would not change a single thing. Not my parents' deaths as much as they hurt, not the stagecoach robbery. Not those terrible weeks of walking and cold and hunger, because all of it led me to you, to this life, to our children and grandchildren. And I would go through it all again, 1,000 times over, if it meant ending up here with you. Xavier's eyes were wet with unshed tears. I have loved you for 32 years, he said, his voice rough with emotion. And I will love you for however many more years God grants us. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Marissa Crawford. You took a lonely man with a half-built ranch and turned his house into a home, his life into something worth living. Everything good in my world exists because of you. They kissed then, soft and sweet, the fire crackling in the background and the wind singing outside. It was a kiss that held 3 decades of shared joys and sorrows, of children raised and grandchildren welcomed, of dreams achieved and challenges overcome together. The years that followed were gentler. Xavier gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to William, though he still rode out most days to check on things. Marissa spent her time with her grandchildren, teaching them to sew and to read, telling them stories about the old days. Sarah married her rancher's son in 1918, and they built a house on another portion of the Crawford land. In 1920, Xavier and Marissa celebrated their 47th wedding anniversary. All of their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a huge party. There were 17 grandchildren now, ranging from little Xavier, who was 12, to baby Rose, who was only 6 months old. The house overflowed with family, and the celebration lasted for 3 days. On the actual anniversary, after everyone had gone to bed, Xavier and Marissa walked out to the barn. It was a clear night, cold but not bitterly so, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. I wanted to come out here, Xavier said, his arm around Marissa's shoulders. To the place where it all started. They stood near where the haystack had been all those years ago. It was long gone now, replaced by a new building, but they both knew the exact spot. That haystack saved my life, Marissa said. And then you saved my life. And then we built this life together, out of nothing but hope and hard work and love. I would do it all again, Xavier said. Every hard year, every challenge, every moment, because they all led to this, to right now with you beside me and our family sleeping in that house. Marissa turned to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. I love you, Xavier Crawford. I have loved you since I was a frightened girl of 20, and you were a kind man who gave up his bed for a stranger. I love you more now than I did then, because I know you in ways I could never have imagined back then. You are my best friend, my partner, my great love. You are everything. And you are my heart, Xavier said simply. You always have been from that very first night. They kissed under the stars, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had lasted through everything life could throw at them. Xavier lived to the age of 78, passing peacefully in his sleep in 1932, with Marissa holding his hand. She grieved him deeply, but she also celebrated the incredible life they had shared. At his funeral, attended by what seemed like half of North Dakota, Marissa spoke about the man he had been. "Xavier Crawford was a man of few words," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. But his actions spoke volumes. He took in a desperate stranger on a cold November night and offered her not just shelter, but kindness and respect. He worked harder than any man I have ever known, building a legacy that will last for generations. He loved his children and grandchildren with a fierce devotion, and he loved me with a constancy and depth that I have been blessed to experience for nearly 50 years. The world is dimmer without him, but it is also immeasurably brighter for his having been in it. Marissa lived for another 12 years after Xavier's death, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. She never remarried, always saying that she had been lucky enough to experience a great love once, and that was enough for any lifetime. She spent her final years living with William and Rebecca, helping to care for the newest generation of Crawfords. She would sit in her rocking chair by the window, sewing or reading, and children would come to her for stories. Her favorite story to tell, the one the grandchildren begged for again and again, was about a cold November night in 1883 when a desperate young woman crawled into a haystack to stay warm, and a kind cowboy found her and changed both of their lives forever. "It sounds like a fairy tale," her great-granddaughter Emma said one day when she was 6 years old. "Like something from a storybook." "It does," Marissa agreed, her eyes distant with memory. "But it was real. It was my life, and it was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to me. I was lost and alone and afraid, and then I found your great-grandfather and everything changed. Love can do that, you know. Real, true love. It can take your life and transform it into something you never imagined possible." "Did you really sleep in hay?" Emma asked, wrinkling her nose. "Was not it scratchy? Terribly scratchy," Marissa laughed. "But I was so cold and tired that I did not care. I just wanted to survive the night. And then great-grandpa found you, he did. He wrapped me in his coat and carried me inside and gave me warm food and a soft bed. And he slept in a chair by the stove so I would not have to take his room. That was the kind of man he was, always putting others first." "I wish I could have known him," Emma said wistfully. "He would have loved you," Marissa assured her. "He loved all of you, even the ones who were not born yet when he died. He used to talk about his descendants, about how the Crawford name would live on because of the family we built together." Marissa passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1944 at the age of 79. She was buried next to Xavier in the family cemetery on the ranch, under a tree they had planted together on their 10th wedding anniversary. The headstone was simple, just their names and dates and a single line that William had chosen: "Together forever." At her funeral, William spoke about his parents and the love they had shared. He was 72 now, with white hair and grandchildren of his own, but when he talked about his mother and father, his voice was full of the wonder and admiration of a small child. "My parents had something special," he said. "Something rare. They met by chance, two people brought together by circumstances that could have ended in tragedy. Instead, they ended in one of the greatest love stories I have ever known. My father once told me that finding my mother was like finding the missing piece of himself that he had not even known was lost. And my mother told me that loving my father was the easiest and the best thing she ever did. They built this ranch together, this family together, this legacy together. And we are all here because on a cold November night in 1883, a cowboy heard a noise in his haystack and went to investigate, and a desperate young woman was brave enough to come out when he called. Everything we have, everything we are, stems from that moment. from their love. The Crawford Ranch continues to this day, passed down through the generations, still run by Xavier and Marissa's descendants. The story of how it all began, of the haystack and the cold night and the two people who found each other against all odds, is told and retold, a family legend that never gets old. And in the family cemetery, under the tree that has grown tall and strong over the decades, two headstones stand side by side. Xavier Crawford, who offered shelter to a stranger and found his heart in return, and Marissa Crawford, who was sleeping in haystacks to stay warm until a cowboy offered her a bed and stayed in the barn, and in doing so, changed both of their lives forever. Their love story, born of kindness and desperation and the courage to hope for something better, became the foundation upon which an entire family was built. It is a legacy that has lasted long past their lifetimes, a testament to the transformative power of love, compassion, and two people who were brave enough to take a chance on each other when they had every reason not to. They found each other in the darkest, coldest moment, and together they built a life full of warmth, light, and enduring love.